All aboard! Welcome to the All Aboard podcast. I am your host, Brandon DeFreitas. We are excited to have you today as we're launching a new podcast series and a little bit of a different topic than we've had in the past. I know, for anyone who's been on the channel before on YouTube, we've had several episodes crossing our Dynasty Fantasy League, one of our redraft fantasy football leagues, and it's been a lot of fun, and it's been mainly geared towards the owners in that league that really I play in. And we wanted to start something a little bit different here that could be geared to a wider audience. And one of the things I was thinking about when I was trying to pick a topic, something to launch here is, how can we do something a little bit unique in the fantasy football industry? And I looked at my own background, CPA. I have around 10 years experience in public accounting, but football has always been my biggest passion. I mean, if you can't tell from the wall behind me here. So I wanted to sort of combine the skills I have with my passion in football, and also, being someone who just joined and launched the Dynasty Football League in the last year. I found that space really fun because it's like you own your own team, and from day one of the startup draft, the players you draft, that's your franchise, and you're going to manage it moving forward. And I thought I would mix my background and numbers here and sort of look at the league in the NFL and go team by team in this first series and analyze contracts and try to do this with the goal of giving a nugget or two and to give everyone out there an advantage in their dynasty leagues, or even potentially nuggets for a redraft league as well. But the goal here is to look at, all right, how much are teams paying these players, and what sort of information can we glean from that, and sort of dig into that to figure out what roles could there be, or who's going to have the first chance at roles for each team. And I think there are some interesting things we're going to find out going through all the teams here. So I'm going to kick it off today. What we have on board for today is just going through the New England Patriots. We're going to start with them, and then in future episodes we're going to have the rest of the AFC East, and then probably end up doing the divisions as one podcast or two. So we're going to see where it takes us, but we do have a fun show here, and I think a couple of nuggets that you can pick up on the Patriots roster based on their contracts. We'll head right into it now. And I think a couple of terms, you don't have to be a cap wizard to understand or figure out what's going on with the contracts. And I know that can be pretty confusing because you look at some teams like the Los Angeles Rams this year, or even the Buffalo Bills, and you're like, oh man, how can they afford this? There's a salary gap in the NFL, and these teams seem to be spending so much more money than the New England Patriots, for example. The At the end of the day, what it boils down to, and what we're going to look at here, is that any amount of cash you pay, that eventually hits your cap. Whether it hits your cap this year or is pushed off to future years, that's another story. But at the end of the day, cash hits cap, and any bonus paid out can be prorated over multiple years. So when you pay a cash salary, that all hits your cap in that current year. But if you get a signing bonus of, just call it $20 million, and it's a 5-year contract, you can spread that 20 million over the 5 years, so that while the player got paid that 20 million at signing, it hits the cap evenly throughout. Or you could differ it and have it hit unevenly throughout. But the bottom line is bonus can be prorated, and any sort of cash you paid eventually hits the cap. And that's what we're going to look at, because as we go into some of these contracts, when we get to like the Dallas Cowboys, it's going to be really interesting looking at Ezekiel Elliott's contract, for example, and how much dead money they have on that deal. A little background on dead money. Dead money is when you've spent cash or given the player cash that hasn't hit your cap yet. That's dead money. If you trade them, that has to hit your cap. It's not going to hit the team's cap that's taking on that contract. Any amount of cash you as a team pay a player is going to hit your cap at some point. So that's the idea with dead cap. And with that, I think we just hop right into it. I think everyone's going to get the gist of it and sort of figure it out, and we'll explain some of the terms as we go through. But Just keep that in mind. Anytime you have a big contract, there's usually a large signing bonus. And if a team eventually looks on to move on from that player, that amount of cash that they already gave the player is going to keep hitting their cap. And that's something to look at. And, as much as we like to think that, it's all merit based on the football field, not every football team is like that. And you'll see, and we'll try to point out in each podcast, like, just keep that in the back of your mind. Like a team like the Dallas Cowboys, I keep using the Zeke contract. Like, they're, people in the industry often accuse them of playing Ezekiel Elliott over Tony Pollard because of how much money they have invested in Zeke, versus a team like the Patriots, who notoriously don't seem to care where they draft a player or how much money they give them. They're going to play who's performing best on the field. So you have to keep that in mind as you go. But at the same token, I think it's important because when you pay a player big money, like, maybe they don't win the job, but they're going to have the first opportunity at it. And that's something that when you look at fantasy football, it's talent and it's opportunity. And looking for these opportunities is really what fantasy football is all about. And bringing it back to the Dynasty context, this is important because when you're playing Dynasty, it's not just about the roles for this year and for redraft. You're trying to make some long-term bets too. And if you can get ahead of the market and know that, okay, this player might have an opportunity next year and my league mates haven't figured that out yet, you might be able to get a good deal and take advantage of that. And that's what I want to help provide here by going team by team and pointing out these scenarios where maybe it's time to buy this player. Like, there's a potential opportunity in the future. And now look, things change in the NFL so fast that, as we all know, like, if you look at a roster from like 3 or 4 years ago, it's going to look completely different for almost any team than it looks now. So you do want to keep that in mind, but having these nuggets in your head, I think, can really help going forward and gain an edge. I'll just give a quick example on the Establish the Run podcast. Great website to Establish the Run. Evan Silva, one of the owners there, in the middle of last season, said, hey, look, Mitchell Trubisky, it looks like he's going to be a hot candidate for a quarterback job next during free agency. And lo and behold, any Dynasty owner who went and picked up Mitchell Trubisky is pretty happy about it because he got a starting job, or at least is going to start for the Steelers to start the season this year. And if you're in a super flex format, any starter is worth a lot in fantasy football. Any starting quarterback in a super flex, that has value. And so if you can get ahead of that, pick him up off the waiver wire for free or get him cheap in a trade, that sort of gave an advantage. And I know in the Dynasty League I play in, one of my buddies did that with Mitchell Trubisky, and now all of a sudden has good quarterback depth going into this year. So those are the types of nuggets we're looking to find. And the reason I'm starting off with the Patriots is been a lifelong Patriots fan. So, sort of start off with, my own home team, got certainly a little bit extra knowledge following the team for so many years. But certainly from this perspective, the Patriots are a tough team to figure out contract wise, and they're always just trying to breed competition. So there's not as many like takeaways we can take from the Patriots versus some other teams. But I did want to start here just to start off this series with the hometown team. So with that, we're going to jump right in. Quarterback position. And just like I was saying, not a whole lot you can figure out here on the contract because you have Mac Jones, who's in the second year of his rookie deal. And they just drafted Bailey Zappi, who has a 4-year rookie contract. Brian Hoyer's the other backup quarterback who, at this point is more like a player coach, I would say. So with Zappi on the 4-year rookie deal, you figure he's probably the backup over the next few seasons. And then for Mac Jones, he has that 4-year rookie contract and the 5th-year option. And if I'm looking at it from a dynasty perspective, that to me means Mac Jones has a minimum of 2 more years as a starter for the Patriots. Probably more because he looked good in his rookie season. But the reason I'm saying a minimum of 2 more years is at the end of that 3rd year, which is where Kyler Murray is at this offseason, is when you can extend these players off their rookie contract. And we've seen this offseason with Kyler Murray, like sure, you could say you get the 4 years plus the fifth year option. How many successful quarterbacks have we seen actually go to their fifth year option? And Kyler, after 3 years, already, making some noise, wants a new contract. And I think that's a big milestone for Mac Jones, too, because if he plays much like he did in his rookie season this year, he's going to be asking for a contract after the end of the third year, too. So I think that's a really big milestone here. And a couple more examples. You look at Baker Mayfield, he got the fifth year contract. He just got traded away the other day, and the Carolina Panthers had the Browns eat a ton of the money off that fifth year option. So generally, you find out after 3 years if you're worth that large contract, and you're probably paid between the 3 and 4 year mark. All this to say that I think from a Mac Jones dynasty perspective, the Patriots have to make a decision or have a good idea of where they're going after his third season as a starter. So as a dynasty manager, you always have to plan for worst case scenario. And to me, worst case scenario for Mac Jones is he's getting the next 2 years as the starter. Absolute worst case. If he flops this season, I guarantee it's going to be blamed a lot on, having Matt Patricia and Joe Judge calling the offense, and he'll get another chance his third year. So at the quarterback room, you have a long-term backup right now in Bailey Zappi there at least the next 4 seasons. Presumably he looks any good, but probably good enough to be a backup we've seen in the past with these quarterbacks the Patriots draft. And then Mac Jones, I look at it and I say, if I'm a dynasty manager for him, at a minimum, the next 2 seasons, he already looked pretty good. So I think he's probably the long-term starter for the team, but really no nugget here, I would say, to pick up on, and no actionable item at the quarterback position for a dynasty manager for the New England Patriots. With that, we move on to the running back position, and where there wasn't much to figure out at the quarterback position, there's a whole lot to sink our teeth in at running back. And that's because you look at the top two backs, Damian Harris and Ramondre Stevenson. They were a really good backfield together last year. But Damian Harris, this is the last year of his rookie deal that he's going into right now. And if you think back over the last 5, 6, 7 years for the New England Patriots, they've never really extended a running back. They tend, like, their preferred method with the running back room is to draft and just have that next line come up, draft, develop, and replace. That's what they do at the running back position typically. And it goes back to when they drafted both Shane Vereen and Stephen Ridley. Neither got extended at the end of their deals, and they just brought in the next crop, which ended up at the time being, I think they went from them to LeGarrette Blount, who they traded a draft pick for. And after LeGarrette Blount, you brought a Dion Lewis, and then you eventually drafted Sony Michel, Damian Harris, and then Ramondre Stevenson. And this year they brought in Pierre Strong and Kevin Harris. So they're always going to lean towards drafting the running backs, having them play a couple seasons as a starter, and then moving on to the next thing. And they very much sort of lean towards, you do need a quality running back, but it's almost like system offensive line over like paying a star running back, which brings me to Damian Harris, who had a really good season last year, a lot of touchdowns. But I believe, based on the history of the New England Patriots, they're very likely not to re-sign him. And that's not a sure thing, but if I'm a dynasty manager, I'm operating under the assumption that the most likely scenario is that Damian Harris does not come back to the team next year. So what does that mean for the backfield? Well, if Damian Harris isn't back next year, you would think Ramondre Stevenson, who's entering his third year, well, he has 3 years, second year of his rookie contract. So he's got 2022, 2023, and 2024 left. So you would expect Stevenson going into his third season would get 2 years as the potential starter. That's a possibility for sure. But you also have these two rookies, Pierre Strong and Kevin Harris. And Pierre Strong kind of reminds me of, he's an outside zone runner, and he has a little bit of passing game chops too. So like if you're bringing it back to the, Stephen Ridley, Shane Vereen, Pierre Strong sort of like the Shane Vereen, and Kevin Harris is, the 1-2 down back who's more like the Stephen Ridley. And I had this quote doing research for this from NFL.com's Lance Zierlein. He has scouting reports on NFL.com for every rookie that comes out. He's great, does a podcast with Dane Brugler of The Athletic too. But Lance Zierlein had this great quote about Kevin Harris and said he catches the ball like it's lava. So he's your classic first and second down pounder. And why am I pointing this all out? I think I want, these dynasty owners to realize that if I'm an owner of Damian Harris, I'm sort of expecting him to become a free agent next year and look for an opportunity elsewhere. Ramondre Stevenson, I would say, is a potential target for teams because there's a good chance he's a potential lead runner in this offense for the next 2 seasons. And he's got a chance this year of potentially supplanting Damian Harris as well. So you have committee this year and then probably a lead runner the next 2 years, depending on what Pierre Strong and Kevin Harris become. But again, we don't know what Pierre Strong and Kevin Harris are yet. So I would say, like, if I'm a dynasty manager right now, my biggest actionable item on the Patriots backfield is buy Ramondre Stevenson in the dynasty format, just based on Harris leaving, and then you have the 2 rookies behind them. So yeah, there's definitely a lot to dig in here at the running back position for the Patriots. The next thing I think is important to note too is the passing game back. And for years, it's been James White, who I left off as, what I was saying, that whole sequencing of the running backs they drafted over the years. James White was really the guy who replaced Shane Vereen, and he's been awesome. I think he's one of the premier pass get down backs in the league. A couple of years ago in 2020, saw his pass blocking success sort of decline. And, we didn't get to see it to fruition last year, but he played a couple games and Mac Jones loved targeting him. So smart player. He runs the routes. He's a great security blanket. He'd be awesome to have from Mac Jones. The problem is, according to ESPN's Mike Reese, he did not progress very far at minicamp, and it seems fairly likely he's going to be on the PUP list to start the season. He's starting to get up there in age too. So when I look at James White, I'm sort of not building. I'm assuming he's not really doing much in a dynasty format until I see it. He's 30 years old. He's entering his 9th year. So really, from his perspective, I think anything the Patriots are getting from him is a bonus. And digging into his contract here, it looks like the Patriots sort of treat it the same way. On the surface, it's a 2-year, $5 million contract he signed this spring. But when you dig a little deeper, only $500,000 is guaranteed. So that means if they cut him this spring, or if he never plays it down, they just cut him. They're just out $500,000 off their cap. That's it. And the next season, so this season is his cap hit for this season, if he stays on, is 1.5 million. That jumps to 2.5 million next year if he's still on the roster, but there's 0 dead cap after this season. The signing bonus, the 500,000 guaranteed at signing, is the only thing on the cap that's guaranteed. So the whole point of this is they can move on from James White without much of a headache. And I think, what we're gleaning here from the contract details is that the Patriots aren't counting on James White either. And so from a fantasy manager's perspective, I think it's worthwhile to look at their backfield and try to identify a pass down back and sort of be like, okay, if it's not James White, who's going to be here? And I think the primary options, if you look at it, Damian Harris has never been super involved in the passing game. I think and you know what? I think he came out. He does have some pass game chops, but he just hasn't really worked out. Sort of like a Sony Michel, where you thought maybe he was going to do a little bit more once he reached the NFL, but he hasn't. So I don't think it's Damian Harris. You look at Pierre Strong and Kevin Harris. Outside of Stevenson last year and Sony Michel at the end of his rookie year, rookie running backs for the New England Patriots are usually redshirted. James White was, Shane Vereen was. I can't remember Stephen Ridley too much for his rookie season, but typically these guys take time to get into the system and, learn the pass protections and everything. And that brings it even more important for a passing down back. It seems to me like fairly unlikely Pierre Strong would come out and be the passing down back in his rookie year. So I'm looking at two guys who I think are probably competing for it, and that's Ramondre Stevenson and Ty Montgomery. And you might be like, oh, gross, Ty Montgomery. But I do think those are the two most likely pass down backs for the Patriots this season, presuming James White ends up missing time. And, like we said, it sort of seems like that's where we're heading. You look at Ty Montgomery, and from what I was reading from the beat reporters this spring, I think he was working out at wide receiver, but multiple reporters sort of mentioned Ty Montgomery as a quote Debo Samuel type player for the Patriots. And that's role, not talent, obviously. Montgomery started off as a receiver with the Green Bay Packers early in his career and then became a running back. So I think he can perform in that role. And you look at his contract, it's eerily similar to James White. It's a 2-year deal, only 300,000 guaranteed. So much like James White, they can easily move on from Ty Montgomery. Ends up, his cap hit would be 1.6 million if nothing changes this year, 1.9 in 2023. So you're not talking a whole lot of money tied up in Ty Montgomery. And sort of to put a big bow on this, if I'm looking at this based on Ramondre Stevenson's success, that's the really big takeaway here for a dynasty owner. I think it's just buy Ramondre Stevenson. I'm not putting too many chips on the passing down backs anywhere. James White's questionable with the injury. Ty Montgomery, it's only 300,000 total guaranteed. I'm not really counting on that. But Stevenson's a player who was explosive for them, was really good in the passing game last year, had some pass blocking issues, but that was as a rookie. So opportunity to improve. I think I put my chips there on him being a pass down back, having an additional role there this season, and then being the lead back going forward for the next 2 years. So looking at everything at a whole, that's what I would expect at the running back position for the Patriots. I should mention, I kind of skimmed over JJ Taylor a little bit. And the reason I did was he had some opportunity last year to win the pass down back role when James White went down and Brandon Bolden ended up taking it over. But Taylor had some fumbles, I believe, in that Tampa Bay game. He fumbled, and he's a smaller back. He doesn't look like he holds up very well in pass protection. He was an undrafted free agent in 2020. So he's entering his 3rd year of his UDFA deal. He'd be a restricted free agent at the end of the season. He's got to show a lot in training camp, I think, to even make the roster. And again, like reading the tea leaves, they brought back James White. They brought in Ty Montgomery. They drafted Pierre Strong. I don't think the Patriots are counting on JJ Taylor. It'd be a nice thing if it happened, but I highly doubt they're counting on him. He has no guaranteed money left on his contract, so they can cut him without any sort of repercussion on that end. So I would say you're looking at it, and Stevenson's really the big buy here from a dynasty perspective. And I think that sort of wraps up the running backs in a bow here. We'll move on to wide receivers. Hopefully that wasn't a little bit too much to go over, but they do have a lot of depth at running back and a lot going on. My bet would be that Damian Harris plays out his contract and they don't trade him in the preseason. But if some of the younger backs end up performing pretty well, you never know. They could move on from Damian in the preseason. Wide receiver, this is really the collection of wide receiver twos, I would say. That they brought in Devontae Parker this year. They have Jacoby Myers, Kendrick Bourne, Nelson Aguilar. I mean, we can criticize the receiver room all we want, but these are players that there are teams out there that could use guys like this. Like, I mean, the Green Bay Packers, for example, who have Alan Lazard as their number one wideout. Like, I like all 4 of these guys better than Alan Lazard, to be honest with you. So I think the Patriots just have a deep collection of wide receiver twos. No wide receiver one, no primary option at the receiver position on their team. And then they drafted Tyquan Thornton in the 2nd round. So that's really your top 5 that we're going to end up going through here. Overall, million-foot view on the Patriots wide receiver room. it just seems so hard for any of these guys to really differentiate themselves and get enough of a target share to be a true difference maker at the position. But there are talented guys, and it's not out of the question that one does emerge. I just think that it's a crowded room, and if they're not going to trade one away, and we'll give you a trade candidate here as we go through the contracts, it's just hard to see, someone really truly emerging from a fantasy perspective. Well, let's look at all of them right here. Devontae Parker, they traded for him this offseason. And one of the attractive things for Devontae Parker was his contract. He has no guaranteed money left. They can move on at any time with no dead cap. And his salary is very reasonable. $6 million cap hit for 2022, $6.3 million cap hit for 2023. And it's reasonable to the point where, like, you look at those receiver markets on the contract this offseason, where the top guys are now making, 25, $24 million. Having Devontae Parker at, 6 and 6.3 is just an incredible value. And look, not a top guy, but in 2019 did put up 1,000 yards and had a really good season with Ryan Fitzpatrick at the helm. So what I'm thinking here from a dynasty perspective is, if he performs well this season, you're looking at a likely new deal. It's hard to see him performing really well and hitting for the Patriots and then not getting a new deal and seeing him play under a $6 billion contract the following year with no guaranteed money left. So I think Devontae Parker, he'll be around in 2023, but if they want him to play and he actually plays well this year, you're probably looking at, you're going to have to give him a contract extension. Jakobi Meyers, he's been a favorite target of Mac Jones. Brady liked him too. I think the thing with Jakobi Meyers is he's really reliable. He knows the offense. He can diagnose coverages and actually generates a good amount of separation, but he's just not explosive at all. And you can see it in, like, how long did it take him to get his first touchdown in the NFL? I think that's something you have to consider. Like, I don't think he's ever going to be a difference maker in a fantasy format, but I think in the right environment, you could see Jakobi Meyers, racking up a good amount of catches in a half PPR or full PPR format. So I think he's just a really steady, solid wide receiver who, he needs volume to truly make a difference in fantasy. And he's not going to get volume in this offense with this amount of receivers and the two tight ends with Jonnu Smith and Hunter Henry. So that's where I see Meyers. But the interesting thing about Meyers now is he only has 1 year left, and this is on his restricted free agent tender. So it's $3.9 million. And if they don't re-sign him, he's an unrestricted free agent next offseason. So there have been some rumblings that they're talking contract with Jakobi Meyers. I wouldn't be surprised if he gets re-signed this spring. He's their kind of receiver, and we're going to talk about, as we go through all these guys, you're going to hear the same thing, like Devontae Parker. Like, yeah, he's under contract next season, but hard to see him play if he's playing well. So, can you really, it's either like you're carrying him and he's okay next year, or he does really well and you're re-signing him. Jakobi Meyers, same deal. He's not going to be here next year if you don't give him an extension. And to give you guys the high end of what you're looking at if they re-sign Jakobi Meyers, I looked at, a slot player who just got a contract this offseason, Hunter Renfrow. And this is high end because Renfrow scored a lot more touchdowns and I think is a better player than Jakobi Meyers anyway. But Renfrow got a 2-year extension for $32 million, $21 million of that being guaranteed. So I think that's sort of the high end you're looking at in Jakobi Meyers. But I mean, you look at Renfrow's contract, 2 years, $32 million. That's even 2 years, 21. He's getting an average of $10 million guaranteed a season. Maybe it's not guaranteed, but Jakobi Meyers is going to be at least around the double digit, $10 million a season. However you slice it at some point, when he resigns. So he's not a top receiver, but I'd expect his contract to run in the 10 to 12 million a season type range. And yeah, I can understand both sides of the arguments from a Patriots fan who probably wouldn't be super excited to see him sign that contract, but he is such a reliable target for Mac Jones. So Parker, Myers, we're talking about new deals a lot. And, best case scenario, or I guess like based on what they have on the books right now, only Parker's around. That brings us to Kendrick Bourne, who like now his contract looks like such a value. He only has 2.8 million guaranteed left. So not a whole lot of guaranteed money left for the player. And, yes, they could move on from him pretty easily, but he was so productive last year with over 800 yards, 5 touchdowns, made a lot of plays in the running game. Like, this is a bargain bin contract too. You're talking a $6.4 million cap hit in 2022 and a $6.9 million contract in 2023. So I have him in the Devontae Parker category, where if he outperforms his contract, he's probably going to be looking for a new deal next year, because that will be entering the last year of his deal, $6.9 million on the cap, but almost no guaranteed money left. Let me double check here. Yeah, next season, dead cap 1.4 million. So not a whole lot of guaranteed money left after this season for Kendrick Bourne. But he will be around next year. And then finally brings us to Nelson Aguilar, who has 1 year left. It's a $14.8 million cap hit. It's a lot. But again, like, when you have the top receivers in the game making 25 million, I know 14.8 is an overpay for Nelson Aguilar, but if he was on the open market, he's probably getting around $12 million. So it's not that egregious in my mind. Aguilar is easily the most obvious trade cut candidate this offseason if the Patriots want to make some room. And that's going to be if you have a youngster like Trey Nixon or Tyquan Thornton prove that they're ready. And if they do, you could see them move on from Nelson Aguilar. Aguilar, just based on if we pull up his contract here, if they cut Nelson Aguilar, he has $5 million of his salary that's guaranteed this year. So let me break this down further for you. $14 million, we'll round it off. 9 million of that is base salary, and that's paid throughout the season. 5 million of that is his signing bonus from last year that's prorated to this season. So if they trade Nelson Aguilar, the Patriots are already in for that $5 million signing bonus. They've already paid it, like we said at the top of the show. So the Patriots are creating $9 million in cap space, rounded off. But if they release Nelson Aguilar, 5 million of his base salary is also guaranteed. So that's a $10 million dead cap hit. And that would only clear around $5 million in cap space. Actually, even less. It would be closer to $4 million in cap space. So the difference is, if you can trade him, it's only a $5 million dead cap, which is the signing bonus. If you cut him, it's 10 million. So there's a $5 million difference between trading and cutting. And it's tough to look at a team in the NFL and be like, who's going to take on a $14.8 million cap hit from Nelson Aguilar? That said, though, again, like I mentioned, like the Green Bay Packers, like if they go into camp and they don't like what they see and they can bring in an Aguilar to work with Aaron Rodgers this season, probably wouldn't be the worst fit. Baltimore Ravens could use a veteran wide receiver after they traded Marquise Brown. 14.8 million. Like it's not totally egregious. Like I said, I think his market value would be around 12 million. So maybe the Pats can eat a portion of that, split the difference with the team. Maybe they eat, an extra 2.5 million. And then that still saves them 2.5 million on the cap versus cutting him. So I think what you're going to see in training camp is, how ready are Tyquan Thornton and Trey Nixon? If they prove ready, maybe they move on from Nelson Aguilar if they can trade him. But again, I mean, they sort of do need depth, so I wouldn't be surprised if he's around. But from as we go through this, we're going to get into Tyquan Thornton. From a dynasty perspective, what's the common theme here? Kendrick Bourne and Devontae Parker, they're around in 2023, but if one of them performs well, they're going to need a contract extension. Jacoby Myers, if he doesn't get re-signed this offseason, he'll be a free agent next year. Nelson Aguilar, he's gone next year one way or another, unless he totally, has an amazing season and they re-sign him. It's hard to see. He's also 29 years old. So Aguilar is gone. All this adds up to, I'm a buy on Tyquan Thornton in rookie drafts, or I know he went undrafted in my dynasty league, 10 teams, 3 rounds. So 30 players get drafted. I would have picked Taekwon in the top 30. He didn't go. And the reason I would have is there's a good chance, two of these receivers ahead of him are gone next year, meaning Thornton has a top 3 or a crack at a top 3 role in the offense. And that to me is worth throwing him on your taxi squad for a season, letting him just kind of develop. And then next year, it's, at worst, it's 2 players, well, I shouldn't say at worst, but like based on how the contracts look right now, it's Bourne and it's Devontae Parker entering their final deal, and Taekwon with 3 years left on his rookie deal. So he has an opportunity, if he hits, to really take a prominent role in the receiving room next season. And there's a little bit of an opportunity this offseason too, because if he looks good, if he looks close enough to Nelson Aguilar, they could cut him, they could trade him. So a little less likely on the cut, like we said, they still save some cap, but I think the Pats will be exploring trade options for Nelson Aguilar if Taekwon shows that he's ready. You also have Trey Nixon and N'Keal Harry. The only thing I'll note about N'Keal Harry is he's as good as gone. They would just prefer to trade him, and there's been no interest reported by Mike Reese of ESPN. So N'Keal has a $3 million cap hit this season, $2 million dead cap hit. They can save a little bit extra if they trade him. So I think they're holding out for a trade based on how the preseason goes. But if it doesn't work out, they'll just cut him at the end. So from a dynasty perspective, he's off your radar and he's probably gone. Trey Nixon's a little interesting. He was a rookie last year, drafted. So he's in the second year of his 4-year rookie deal. And he showed a little something in minicamp. So again, like similar to Taekwon Thornton, could be worth an end of your bench spot in a dynasty format, because all those guys ahead of them, we went through Bourne and Parker. Maybe they're probably here next year, but on the last year of their deal, and then potentially no Myers and Aguilar. So there's a lot of opportunity here for the Patriots. And to put a bow on wide receivers, I would say you look at this too. You got a lot of money coming off the books with Nelson Aguilar next year, one way or the other. And I wouldn't be surprised if the Patriots are players in some sort of trade or free agency next offseason. They have a lot. They haven't borrowed from future caps like, the Bills and the Rams have. So I would not be surprised one bit if they end up making a play on a highly paid wide receiver next offseason. So keep that in the back of your mind too. Still worth investing in Taekwon and even potentially throwing Trey Nixon at the end of your bench in a dynasty. But keep in mind, from a Mac Jones perspective, they're probably going to remake this receiving core going into next season with all the space they have on the roster and the cap and cash space they have. We'll wrap things up with the tight ends. And again, it is a fantasy football show, so we're only doing the skill positions. I know, the boomers out there aren't happy about that. We're not talking offensive line. We're not talking defense, but it's fantasy football. We're talking the fun stuff. All right, guys. So, but wrapping it up with the tight ends, just really that you could summarize this with Hunter Henry and Jonnu Smith by just saying they owe a lot of money to both of them, and they're both going to be around this year and next year, likely. Hunter Henry is a candidate for an extension. I would say he has 2 years left. 19 million is guaranteed, but you could spread that guarantee out and create a little bit more cap space if you want. And he's 28 years old. He really showed a great connection with Mac Jones. So I think Hunter Henry is well worth his $15 million cap hit this year, and then 15 and a half in 2023. And I would say overall is an extension candidate for them. Jonnu Smith, on the other hand, had an awful first year with the team, and they really need to find a way to utilize him in some sort of role and get some productivity here, because you look at his cap space this season and then the following 2 seasons, 13.6 million, 14.7 million in 2023, and then 15.7 million in 2024. And the dead cap. So this season, that if they wanted to move on from him, it's a $26.5 million dead cap. He's going nowhere. They just can't do anything about that. Next year, if he really stinks it up again, maybe they move on because they can create $1 million in cap space, but that's still 13.7 million of dead cap. So I think you're looking at Jonnu Smith here for the next 2 seasons, and then they'll get rid of him going into 2024, where it's only a $3.7 million dead cap. So 3.7 million of guaranteed money remaining to be paid. Move on from him, generate around 12 million of space at that time. I think that's probably what you're doing with Jonnu Smith. So long story short, on the tight ends, I'm putting my chips on Hunter Henry, as you know, he's going to be the primary guy. He's going to see the targets. He probably is the most reliable pass catcher fantasy wise on the entire team right now. I think he's a favorite of Mac Jones in the red zone. They're going to utilize him as much as possible. And he's even an extension candidate. Jonnu Smith, you're guaranteed he's going to be on the team for the probably for this year and likely next season. I guess you hope as a dynasty owner that the money that they have invested here means they're going to try some creative things with him. It's possible, but I also look at, how many tight end twos in the history of fantasy football have really been much of anything. And the list is short. So I'm not relying on Jonnu in a dynasty format or doing anything actionable there. You look at the other tight ends on the roster, Devin Asiasi, Dalton Kane. I think the ship has sailed on them, unfortunately. So completely off your radar in a dynasty, but I would sort of expect Hunter Henry to be here long term and get an extension at some point. And like I said, Jonnu here for the next 2 years. So that's really the summary there. But hopefully you guys enjoyed this. We just completed the Patriots. We did the walkthrough there. We're going to do this for every team. What the cadence is going to be, we're going to try to release at least one a week. Maybe it'll be 2 teams a week or something. And, as we get into the offseason, we might get some hype pieces we can talk about on some of these guys, how they're looking in training camp too. But again, the goal here is we're looking at these contracts to say, what is the team doing in the future? And how can we use that information to make moves now in a dynasty to get ahead of our league mates? And to put a total bow on the New England Patriots, I think the items here that I'm doing, I'm trying to acquire Ramondre Stevenson because he has a good chance of being the lead back next season, looking at these contracts. I'm a buy on Hunter Henry. I mean, like, how valuable are tight ends if it's not a tight end premium league? Understood, but I think Hunter Henry is going to be the primary passing target in this offense for the next couple seasons. And then I'm also a buy on Tyquan Thornton with a little bit of a, nod towards Trey Nixon too, saying good chance this receiver room looks completely different going into next season. Take a cheap gamble on Tyquan or Trey now. And then sort of, if you're the Mac Jones owner, expect, whole new weapons going into next year. So potentially even a buy on Mac Jones. That'll do it on the New England Patriots part of the show. Again, if you like this, you like the format, please hit that like button and smash that subscribe button. If you want to follow me on Twitter, I am at the Fantasy CPA, and new handle for the new show format. Hope you guys find me over there. We're going to be releasing more of these, having a lot of fun, building the brand a little bit. So thanks again for sticking with us. I'm your host, Brandon DeFreitas, and we'll see you next time on the All Aboard.